Hello, dear listener. Today I have a new story for you. The main character, Susan Smith, a 68-year-old woman, becomes witness to a shocking conversation. Inside the wedding tent, she sees her husband, Robert, the owner of a large freight transportation company, passionately kissing Elaine Carter a plan for a fraudulent bankruptcy that was meant to strip Susan of her share of the family assets and leave her with almost nothing. Instead of causing a scandal, Susan remembers the advice her mother once gave her and begins to act with calm determination and a cold, careful mind. We begin. Enjoy the story and have a wonderful listening experience.
What happens when a devoted wife of 40 years catches her wealthy husband kissing their daughter-in-law on her granddaughter's wedding day? My husband told everyone our trucking company was going bankrupt and we would lose our home. He didn't know I heard his true plan whispered in the shadows of a wedding tent. Watch how I turned his fake bankruptcy into his worst nightmare. By 7 o'clock, the apartment already smelled of starch, coffee, and the faint lemon polish Susan used on the dining table every Friday, even when no one was coming. The wedding was scheduled for noon, but she had been awake since 5:30, moving through the rooms with the careful rhythm of a woman who trusted preparation more than optimism. The silver earrings for her granddaughter were laid beside a folded church program. Next to them sat a small notepad covered with Susan's narrow handwriting. Call florist if roses arrive late. Bring Elaine's medication. Check Robert's garment bag.
She crossed out the last line, then checked the garment bag anyway. Robert was in the bedroom speaking quietly on his phone. He stopped when she entered, smiled too quickly, and asked whether the car service had been confirmed. It was a simple question, but after 42 years of marriage, Susan had learned that her husband became unusually polite when he was hiding a decision he had already made. On the refrigerator door hung an old photograph of Robert standing beside one of his company's first freight trucks, grinning under a Yankees cap. Susan looked at it while the kettle rattled softly behind her. The man in the picture had once worked 16-hour days and come home smelling of diesel and winter air. The man in the bedroom now wore expensive cologne and spoke in lowered tones about lawyers, restructuring, and accounts that apparently could not wait until after his granddaughter's wedding. She poured coffee into 2 mugs. Robert emerged a minute later, slipping his phone into the inside pocket of his jacket. "Busy morning?" she asked. "Always," he said. "The company's dealing with some temporary pressure. Nothing you need to worry about today." Temporary pressure. The phrase stayed with her long after he left the kitchen. Susan opened the cupboard above the microwave and reached, almost without thinking, for a small brass key taped beneath the shelf. She held it in her palm for a moment, feeling its familiar weight. Her mother had given her that key on the day she married Robert. "Love people," her mother had said, while fastening Susan's coat, "but keep one drawer in your life that belongs only to you." At the time, Susan thought it was old-fashioned advice from a woman who had lived through too many disappointments. That morning, with church clothes hanging ready by the door and her husband making secret phone calls before sunrise, the memory no longer felt old-fashioned at all. Susan carried the brass key into the hallway and stood for a moment beside the narrow closet where winter coats hung in careful color order. Outside the apartment, Brooklyn was waking up in layers. A delivery truck backing down the alley, a radio playing salsa somewhere below, footsteps on the brownstone stairs. She slipped the key into her handbag. The gesture was so automatic that she almost laughed at herself. For 40 years, that key had opened a small metal box in a storage room 2 floors down. Inside were insurance papers, copies of property deeds, several handwritten notes from her mother, and a collection of business documents Robert had once asked her to keep safe because she was, in his words, the only person in this family who never loses anything. He had forgotten saying it. Susan never had. By 8 o'clock, their daughter Denise arrived with a cloud of perfume and garment bags. Mom, please tell me you're ready, Denise said, kissing her cheek. Maya is already panicking about the seating cards. A bride has the right to panic, Susan replied. Denise laughed, then lowered her voice. Dad seems distracted today. Susan folded a linen napkin that did not need folding. He says the company has financial pressure. Denise's smile faded for a second. Again? The word again settled heavily between them. Robert's freight company, Smith Atlantic Logistics, had grown from 3 trucks in Queens to a regional operation moving electronics, medical supplies, and food shipments across the Northeast. The business had survived fuel crises, strikes, and the recession 15 years earlier. Robert liked to tell people that trucks were the bloodstream of America, and that as long as stores needed shelves filled, his company would survive. Lately, however, he had begun using unfamiliar language: asset exposure, liability restructuring, protective separation. He spoke less like a truck owner and more like the consultants who charged by the hour. Susan watched Denise adjust the hem of a bridesmaid dress. How often has he been talking about financial problems with you? A few months, Denise admitted. He said cash flow was tight because of new federal regulations and insurance costs. I assumed it was normal business stress. Susan nodded, though a small pulse had started beating behind her left eye. A few months. That was longer than Robert had admitted to her. The drive to the church took them through streets lined with August heat. Robert sat in the front beside the driver, answering messages on his phone so frequently that the screen kept lighting his face blue-white in the rearview mirror. At a red light, Susan noticed a name flash briefly across the screen. Elaine Carter. She recognized it immediately. Elaine was the mother of the groom's fiancé's cousin, a complicated connection created by modern blended families and remarriages. Susan had met her several times during wedding planning lunches. Elaine was attractive in a polished Manhattan way: smooth, silver blonde hair, fitted dresses, and the habit of touching a person's forearm when she spoke, as if every conversation were confidential. Why was Robert exchanging messages with her on the morning of their granddaughter's wedding? He caught Susan looking and turned the phone face down. Work, he said before she had asked anything. Susan looked out the window at a laundromat sliding past and thought of another sentence her mother used to repeat. When someone answers a question before you ask it, listen to the answer twice. St. Bartholomew stood on a shaded corner in Brooklyn Heights, its stone steps crowded with florists, photographers, and relatives carrying boxes of programs. Inside, the church smelled of candles and old wood polished by generations of weddings and funerals. Maya rushed toward her grandmother, white satin gathered in both hands. Grandma, do I look nervous? You look 26, Susan said, smoothing a loose strand of hair behind Maya's ear. That's close enough. Maya hugged her tightly. For a few minutes, the morning became simple again. Susan helped pin a boutonniere onto a nervous usher, found safety pins for a bridesmaid, and located the missing ring pillow under a stack of hymn books. She had always been the family's quiet problem solver, the woman who carried aspirin, tissues, extra buttons, and the phone numbers nobody else remembered to save. Robert appeared briefly in the bridal preparation room. Susan, have you seen my navy folder? No. If anyone asks, I'll be near the reception tent. Near the reception tent. Not with the family photographs. Not greeting relatives who had traveled from Chicago and Atlanta. Susan watched him leave and noticed that his tie was slightly crooked, something he normally corrected immediately. Robert cared about appearances with almost military discipline. An anxious man forgets small things. The reception was being held in a garden behind the church, where a large white tent had been erected beneath strings of hanging lights. Caterers moved between folding tables carrying trays of glassware. The band was tuning its instruments,
sending scattered notes of trumpet and piano into the humid afternoon air. Susan went looking for bottled water for Maya. As she approached the side of the tent, she heard voices behind one of the fabric partitions used to hide catering supplies from guests. She would have walked past without noticing anything unusual, except that Robert laughed. A low, intimate laugh she had not heard from him in years. She stopped. Elaine answered with a softer laugh.
The fabric wall shifted slightly in the breeze, leaving a narrow opening where two panels overlapped. Susan saw Robert first. His hand was resting against Elaine's waist. Then he kissed her. Not a confused accident, not a brief emotional mistake, a practiced kiss. Susan's fingers tightened around the unopened bottle of water until the plastic crackled. Neither of them noticed her. Elaine leaned her forehead against Robert's shoulder. "After today," she whispered, "we won't have to pretend much longer." Susan should have walked away. Instead, she remained perfectly still, hidden by the fluttering white fabric, while the wedding music drifted faintly from the garden beyond. Robert spoke next, his voice carrying the brisk confidence he used in business meetings. "The bankruptcy filing is already prepared. Once the company shows the losses from the warehouse acquisition, the creditors will focus on the corporate accounts, not the personal transfers."
Susan felt the world narrow to the space between two seams of white canvas. Bankruptcy, prepared, personal transfers. Elaine touched his cheek. "And Susan?" Robert exhaled impatiently. "She'll fight at first because she's stubborn, but she doesn't understand the structure. Most of the valuable assets will be protected before she knows what happened." Elaine smiled. "You've been saying that for months." Months. The same word Denise had used in the car. Robert lowered his voice further, but Susan caught every syllable. "By Christmas, this will be over. She'll keep the apartment and think she was lucky. I'm tired of living like I owe explanations for every decision I make." Elaine kissed him again. "Soon we'll finally be free of the tiresome Susan." For a second, Susan heard nothing at all. Not the band, not the caterers, not the traffic beyond the church walls. Then sound returned in a rush. A glass clinked somewhere nearby. Someone called for more ice.
A child laughed near the garden entrance. Inside the tent, Robert and Elaine were discussing seating arrangements for the reception, as casually as if they had not just divided the ruins of Susan's future between them. Susan stepped backward silently. The bottle of water slipped from her hand and rolled into the grass, but the music outside was loud enough to cover the sound. She walked toward the church with measured steps, one hand resting lightly against the stone wall to steady herself. Anyone watching would have seen only a grandmother moving carefully in sensible shoes. Inside her handbag, beneath the church program and the wrapped silver earrings, the small brass key pressed against her palm. For the first time in many years, Susan was grateful that she had never fully trusted happiness to protect her. When she reached the empty side chapel, she sat down in the last pew and opened her handbag. The brass key lay there, dull and ordinary. Robert believed she did not understand the structure. He had forgotten who had typed the early partnership agreements when his company was still operating from a rented office in Queens. He had forgotten who insisted that certain shares remain jointly held after the first expansion loan. He had forgotten the envelope she had placed in the metal box 3 years earlier after noticing irregular transfers between two corporate accounts. Susan closed her fingers around the key and listened to the distant swell of wedding music beginning outside. In a few minutes, she would walk back into the garden, smile for the photographs, and watch her granddaughter begin a new life. But another ceremony had already taken place behind the white walls of that tent, and Susan had heard every vow. Chapter 2. The White Tent. Susan remained in the side chapel until the bells rang for the ceremony.
She used the quiet to do something she had learned as a young receptionist, long before she became a wife, a mother, and eventually a grandmother. She separated emotion from sequence. First, Robert was having an affair with Elaine. Second, the affair had been going on for months. Third, they were planning a bankruptcy filing. Fourth, Robert believed Susan did not understand the company's legal structure. Only after she arranged the facts in that order did she allow herself to feel the humiliation hidden inside them. She looked down at her hands. The left one still wore the gold wedding band Robert had placed there in a small church in Queens 42 years earlier. The band suddenly seemed less like a symbol of devotion and more like an old contract whose other signatory had already stopped honoring it. The organ music began. Susan stood, smoothed the front of her navy dress, and walked back toward the main sanctuary. The ceremony unfolded with the gentle predictability of hundreds of family weddings before it. Maya entered on her father's arm, trembling with excitement. Guests smiled, dabbed at their eyes, and leaned together during the vows. Susan smiled too. Years of church suppers, hospital visits, school recitals, and funerals had taught her that adults sometimes carry private catastrophes while continuing to pass hymn books down the pew. When the minister asked whether anyone objected to the marriage, Susan almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. The only marriage collapsing that afternoon was her own, and no minister could stop that ceremony now. Robert sat beside her, attentive and composed. Once, during a prayer, his hand briefly touched hers. The contact nearly made her pull away. Instead, she let her hand remain still and noticed something important. His fingers were cold. He was nervous. Not guilty enough to stop, but nervous enough to fear something. That distinction mattered. After the ceremony, the guests moved into the garden for photographs. Sunlight filtered through the trees, leaving shifting patterns across the white tent and the tables covered in ivory linen. Susan watched Robert from a distance. He moved easily between relatives, laughing with cousins, shaking hands with old business associates, posing for pictures with Maya and her new husband. Elaine circulated through the crowd with equal confidence, carrying herself like a woman who believed her future had already been secured. Only once did their eyes meet across the garden. Elaine smiled warmly, the smile of a family friend sharing a joyful occasion. Susan returned the smile with such calm politeness that Elaine looked away first. That, too, mattered. People who believe they have power often become careless around someone who appears harmless. During the cocktail hour, Susan slipped into the small reception office beside the catering area. The room contained stacked folding chairs, extension cords, and a temporary desk where the wedding coordinator kept schedules and emergency supplies. She closed the door quietly and took out her phone. The first number she dialed went to voicemail. The second was answered on the fourth ring. "Miriam Rosen speaking." Susan lowered her voice. "Miriam, it's Susan Smith." A pause. "Susan, is everything all right? I thought you were at your granddaughter's wedding." "I am." Miriam had been Susan's attorney for nearly 15 years, originally hired when Robert's company expanded into interstate freight contracts. She was meticulous, discreet, and one of the few people who knew that Susan owned more of the business infrastructure than most family members realized. "I need to ask a hypothetical question," Susan said. Miriam sighed softly. "When clients say hypothetical, I usually start taking notes." Despite everything, Susan almost smiled. If a closely held corporation were preparing a bankruptcy filing and one of the shareholders suspected assets were being transferred improperly, what could be done immediately? The silence on the line sharpened. "That is no longer a hypothetical question, is it?" "No." Miriam's tone changed completely. Do not confront anyone. Do not sign anything, and tell me exactly what you heard. Susan repeated the conversation from the tent as precisely as she could remember it. Years of balancing household accounts and proofreading Robert's early contracts had given her an unusually accurate memory for numbers and phrasing. When she finished, Miriam spoke carefully. Did he mention the warehouse acquisition specifically? Yes. Susan, that acquisition was financed through a holding company that requires both shareholder approvals for any substantial asset transfer. Robert cannot legally move those assets without your signature unless documents have been forged.
Susan felt a slow, controlled breath leave her lungs. Are you certain?
Absolutely. I drafted the amendment myself after the Albany expansion. Albany. The word opened a door in Susan's memory. 3 years earlier, during a winter audit, she had noticed several unusually large transfers between Smith Atlantic Logistics and a newer entity called Harbor Ridge Holdings. Robert had dismissed them as temporary tax positioning adjustments. Susan had not argued, but she had quietly requested copies of the supporting documents and placed them in the metal box downstairs. At the time, she could not have explained why she kept them. Now she could. A knock sounded at the office door. Mrs. Smith? They're about to cut the cake. It was the wedding coordinator. I'll be right there, Susan answered, ending the call. Before leaving, Miriam added one final instruction. Tonight, get those documents somewhere safe. And Susan? Yes?
If Robert thinks you know nothing, that is currently your strongest advantage.
The reception had grown louder by the time Susan returned. Jazz standards drifted through the tent, waiters carried trays of crab cakes and miniature biscuits, and Maya was laughing as guests teased the newlyweds about honeymoon plans. Susan allowed herself to be pulled into family photographs, one with Maya, one with Denise, one with Robert. Standing beside him for the photograph felt strangely theatrical. The photographer kept asking them to stand closer. You two look like newlyweds yourselves, he joked. Robert wrapped an arm around Susan's waist. The camera flashed. Susan wondered whether anyone looking at that picture years later would notice that her smile never reached her eyes. Dinner began just after sunset. From her seat near the center of the tent, Susan could observe both Robert and Elaine without appearing to watch either of them. They were careful now. No touches, no lingering conversations. Only the occasional glance that passed between them like a private signal. Halfway through the meal, Robert leaned toward her. You've been quiet tonight. I've been listening, Susan replied. He laughed lightly, assuming it was a harmless remark. That's always been your talent. Yes, Susan thought, and you stopped noticing how dangerous that talent could be. She asked the question casually while buttering a roll. How serious are the company's financial problems? Robert took a sip of wine before answering. Manageable. We may need to restructure some debt and close a warehouse or two, but it's routine business. I didn't want to burden you with it before the wedding. His voice was smooth, practiced, almost affectionate. Susan noticed that he avoided specifics. No numbers, no lenders, no timelines. Lying had become easier for him than explaining. Later, while guests danced, Susan stepped outside the tent for air.
The August evening was warm, carrying the scent of cut grass and river humidity from the harbor. Denise joined her a moment later, slipping off her heels. Please tell me I'm not the only one exhausted. You're definitely not the only one. They stood together, watching the lights glow through the tent walls. Mom, Denise said quietly, is something wrong with you and Dad? Susan turned toward her daughter. Denise had inherited Robert's dark eyes, but not his ability to hide concern. For one dangerous moment, Susan wanted to tell her everything.
The kiss, the conversation, the bankruptcy plan, the contempt in Robert's voice when he spoke about being free of his wife. But inside the tent, Maya was beginning her first dance with her husband. This night belonged to the newlyweds, not to the wreckage of an older marriage. So Susan chose her words carefully. Your father and I have some things we need to discuss after the wedding. Denise studied her face for a long second. That sounds serious. It is. Are you going to be okay? Susan looked back at the glowing white tent where music and laughter continued as if families were simple things. Yes, she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. I think I finally am. The reception ended close to midnight. Guests hugged the couple goodbye, gathered leftover flowers, and searched for forgotten jackets and gift boxes. Robert was busy coordinating transportation for relatives staying at a nearby hotel. Susan used the distraction to make a decision. When they returned to Brooklyn, she would not sleep. She would go downstairs to the storage room, open the metal box with the brass key, and review every document she had preserved over the years. Partnership agreements, shareholder amendments, warehouse financing contracts, insurance schedules, and the mysterious Harbor Ridge transfer records. Robert believed the company was his kingdom. What he had forgotten was that kingdoms built by two people often leave traces of both builders in the foundation. As the last of the wedding lights dimmed behind them, Susan slipped her hand into her handbag and closed her fingers around the brass key once more. This time, she did not hold it like a keepsake. She held it like evidence. Brooklyn was unusually quiet when they returned home. After the noise of the reception, the clinking glasses, the brass band, the endless congratulations, the apartment on Dean Street seemed to be holding its breath. Robert loosened his tie as soon as he stepped inside and complained about his feet. Susan listened from the kitchen while filling a glass with water. Long day, he said. Yes. Beautiful wedding, though. It was. Their conversation moved across the surface of the evening like two strangers discussing the weather. Robert kissed her cheek lightly before heading toward the bedroom. I'm exhausted. Don't stay up too late.
Susan watched him disappear down the hallway. A few minutes later, she heard the shower running, then the familiar creak of the mattress. She waited another 20 minutes. Patience, her mother used to say, is often mistaken for passivity by people who have never needed it. At 12:40, she put on a light cardigan, picked up her handbag, and left the apartment. The storage room was in the basement of the brownstone, behind the laundry area where the fluorescent light flickered with a faint electrical buzz. The air smelled of detergent, cardboard, and old concrete. Susan unlocked the narrow cage assigned to their apartment and crouched beside a stack of labeled boxes. Christmas ornaments, Denise, school papers, Robert, tax records, 1998 to 2005. Behind them stood a dented green filing cabinet that looked too ordinary to attract attention. She opened the bottom drawer, moved aside a bundle of expired insurance folders, and revealed the small gray metal box. The brass key fit perfectly. Inside, documents were arranged in brown envelopes, each labeled in Susan's careful handwriting. She had not opened some of them in years. She spread the contents across an old folding table beneath the humming basement light. Partnership agreement, shareholder amendment, warehouse financing documents, insurance riders, property deeds. Then she found the envelope marked Harbor Ridge Holdings, copies. Her pulse quickened. The papers inside were dated 3 years earlier, during the Albany warehouse expansion. Susan remembered that period clearly because Robert had been traveling constantly, chasing what he called the contract that will let us slow down in retirement.
She unfolded the first document. Transfer authorization. Smith Atlantic Logistics to Harbor Ridge Holdings. Amount: $1,850,000. Purpose: temporary capital allocation related to warehouse acquisition. A second transfer followed 6 weeks later, then a third.
Nearly $5 million had moved through Harbor Ridge over 8 months. Susan opened another folder containing the ownership structure of Harbor Ridge Holdings. Her eyes stopped on a familiar name, Robert J. Smith, 60% Eleanor Carter, 40% Eleanor. Elaine's legal first name was Eleanor Carter. Susan sat back slowly on the metal chair. The affair had not grown out of the bankruptcy scheme. The business partnership had existed for at least 3 years, which meant the deception was older, deeper, and far more deliberate than a late-life romance. She closed her eyes for a moment, not from grief now, but from the cold realization that she had been living beside a parallel life constructed piece by piece while she organized family holidays and remembered everyone's birthdays. Her phone vibrated. A message from Miriam appeared on the screen. "Are you able to talk?" Susan called immediately. "Tell me you found something," Miriam said. "I found Harbor Ridge ownership documents." "Who owns it?" "Robert and Elaine Carter." Miriam was silent for several seconds. "That changes everything." Susan described the transfers. $5 million over 8 months, Miriam repeated. "And these are copies of signed authorizations?" "Yes." "Do you have the shareholder amendment from the Albany expansion?" Susan found the document and read the relevant section aloud. Miriam interrupted her halfway through. "There it is. Any transfer exceeding $2 million in aggregate related to warehouse collateral requires approval from both Class A shareholders." "Which are Robert and me." "Exactly." Susan looked again at the transfer amounts. Individually, each was under $2 million. Together, they exceeded the threshold by a wide margin. "He split the transfers," she said quietly, "to avoid triggering the approval requirement." The basement suddenly felt colder, despite the August heat outside. Miriam's voice became brisk and professional. "Listen carefully. Tomorrow morning, I want scanned copies of every Harbor Ridge document, the shareholder amendment, and any correspondence related to the Albany warehouse. Do not leave the originals where Robert can find them." "He doesn't know I keep copies." "Good. Keep it that way." After the call ended, Susan continued sorting through the box. Near the bottom, she found something she had almost forgotten: a spiral notebook with faded blue covers. Robert had used it during the company's early years to track truck maintenance, fuel purchases, and driver schedules before they could afford proper accounting software. The handwriting was younger, more hurried. "Truck 3, brakes checked. Call Albany distributor." Susan deposited payroll check. She turned the pages slowly. Back then, they had built the company together from a rented office in Queens with a leaking radiator and a coffee maker that worked only if you held the switch down with a spoon. Susan had answered phones, typed invoices, negotiated with insurance agents, and driven payroll checks to drivers when Robert was on the road. She remembered winter mornings when he came home smelling of diesel fuel and exhaustion, collapsing into a kitchen chair while she reheated soup. When had that man disappeared? Perhaps not all at once. Perhaps betrayal arrived the same way businesses grew. One justified decision, one hidden account, one omitted conversation at a time. At 2:30 in the morning, Susan carried the most important documents upstairs and locked them inside the small fireproof safe hidden behind winter blankets in the hall closet. Robert was asleep when she entered the bedroom. Moonlight from the window fell across his face,
softening the lines that had deepened around his mouth over the years. For a dangerous second, she saw not the man from the tent, but the 26-year-old who had danced with her in a Queen's church basement after their wedding reception because they could not afford a honeymoon. Memory can be cruel that way. It preserves tenderness long after trust has expired. Robert stirred slightly. "Susan?" She froze. "What time is it?" "A little after 2, she answered evenly. "Couldn't sleep?" "Too much coffee at the wedding." He mumbled something indistinct and drifted back to sleep. Susan stood beside the bed, listening to his breathing. He believed she was still the woman who worried about seating charts and flower deliveries. He had no idea that, while he slept, she had uncovered evidence linking his mistress to millions of dollars in questionable corporate transfers. The next morning began with rain. Water streaked the kitchen window, while Susan scanned documents on the old multifunction printer Robert rarely used. She created encrypted digital copies, uploaded them to a secure cloud account Miriam had helped her establish years earlier for estate planning purposes, and printed a separate index of every file. By 9 o'clock, she had assembled a folder thick enough to change several lives. Robert entered the kitchen wearing a golf shirt and carrying his phone. "You're up early again." "I had things to organize after the wedding." He poured coffee and glanced at the scanner. "What's all this?" Susan did not look up from the papers. "Insurance records. I realized some of our household files were outdated." It was not entirely a lie. Robert nodded absently, already distracted by an incoming message. The screen lit briefly, and Susan saw Eleanor appear again before he turned away. "Actually," he said, "I may need to go into Manhattan this afternoon. There's an urgent meeting with the restructuring consultants." "Of course." He studied her for a moment. "You don't seem surprised." Susan finally met his eyes. "You've been talking about restructuring for months, Robert. I'd be more surprised if there weren't meetings." Something flickered across his expression, uncertainty perhaps, or the first faint awareness that his wife was listening more carefully than he had assumed. Then he smiled. "Once this is resolved, things will be easier for both of us." Susan folded the last document into the folder. "Yes," she said softly. "I believe they will." After he left, she carried the folder to the dining table and called Miriam one more time. "There's another issue," Susan said. "The Harbor Ridge ownership documents show Elaine has been involved for at least 3 years. Miriam let out a low whistle. "Then we're no longer looking only at a potential fraudulent bankruptcy. We may be looking at diversion of marital assets, breach of fiduciary duty, and undisclosed related party transactions." The legal terms sounded clinical, almost bloodless, but beneath them Susan heard the real meaning. Robert had not simply planned to leave her. He had been preparing to diminish her financially before leaving. Miriam spoke again. "I want you to come to my office this afternoon. Bring the originals. And Susan?" "Yes?" "From this point forward, assume every financial conversation with your husband is strategic." Susan looked around the apartment. The framed family photographs, the worn armchair where Robert read the newspaper every Sunday, the calendar still turned to August with Maya's wedding date circled in blue ink. For decades, this home had been the center of her married life. Now it felt like a stage set whose hidden walls she had finally learned to open. She closed the folder, placed her hand on top of it, and understood something with surprising clarity. The most important discovery was not the affair. It was the realization that she was not powerless. And for the first time since hearing Robert's voice behind the white tent wall, that thought frightened her husband far more than anything she had yet said aloud. Miriam Rosen's office overlooked Lower Manhattan, where ferries crossed the harbor like slow white stitches on gray water. Susan had visited the building many times over the years, usually for routine estate documents or tax-related signatures. This was the first time she arrived carrying evidence that could destroy her husband's company. Miriam met her in the reception area without her usual small talk. "Come straight in." The conference room smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner. Susan placed the folder on the polished table and watched Miriam put on reading glasses and begin sorting through the documents with the concentration of a surgeon examining scans. 10 minutes passed in silence, except for the rustle of paper. Finally, Miriam looked up. "These copies are excellent." "That's because I made them before I knew why I would need them." Miriam tapped the Harbor Ridge ownership form. "This is the key document. If Elaine Carter held 40% of Harbor Ridge while receiving transfers from Smith Atlantic Logistics, and those transactions were not disclosed to the other shareholder, that's you, then Robert has a serious problem." Susan sat very still. "How serious?" "Potentially serious enough that a bankruptcy court would examine every related party transaction connected to the Albany warehouse." The phrase related party transaction sounded oddly harmless, like an accounting footnote. Yet Susan understood what Miriam was really saying. Robert had been moving money into a company partly owned by the woman he was secretly involved with. Miriam pulled another document from the folder. "What concerns me even more is the timing. These transfers began shortly after the warehouse acquisition, but the supposed financial crisis only appeared recently. That suggests the bankruptcy may be designed not to save the business, but to protect assets that have already been moved." Susan thought of Robert standing beneath the wedding tent lights, laughing with relatives while discussing how she would be left with the apartment and think herself lucky. A strange calm settled over her. "What do we do first?" Miriam outlined the strategy on a yellow legal pad. Secure all evidence. Place a temporary hold on any jointly controlled corporate authorizations. Notify the company's outside auditors that shareholder approval for major transfers is disputed. Do not reveal the affair unless it becomes legally relevant. Let Robert continue believing his plan is undiscovered for as long as possible. Susan listened carefully, asking practical questions about bank access, corporate records, and electronic signatures. Miriam paused midway through her explanation. "You're taking this remarkably well." Susan looked out at the harbor. "No," she said quietly. "I'm taking it usefully." When she returned to Brooklyn that evening, Robert was in unusually good spirits. He had brought home takeout from a Thai restaurant they both liked, and opened the bottle of wine without being asked. "Thought we deserved a quiet dinner after all the wedding chaos," he said. Susan helped set the table. "How was Manhattan?" "Productive." He spoke easily about consultants, lenders, and insurance negotiations, offering just enough detail to sound transparent while avoiding anything concrete. Susan noticed the performance now that she knew to look for it. At one point he mentioned Harbor Ridge casually. "We may have to unwind some warehouse-related entities if the restructuring moves forward." Susan kept her eyes on her plate. "Would that affect us personally?" "Not really. Those entities are mostly operational." Mostly operational. Another careful phrase. She took a sip of water and changed the subject to Maya's honeymoon plans. Robert relaxed immediately, grateful for the safer territory. Watching him, Susan realized something unsettling. Deception had become part of his daily rhythm. He no longer seemed to experience each lie as a separate act. The lies connected smoothly, supporting one another like beams in a structure built over many years. 2 days later, the first crack appeared. Susan was sorting laundry when her phone rang. The caller ID showed Thomas Green, Smith Atlantic's longtime outside accountant. "Mrs. Smith," he said, sounding hesitant. "I received an unusual instruction this morning regarding the Albany warehouse collateral accounts." Susan sat down slowly on the edge of the bed. What kind of instruction? Mr. Smith requested expedited authorization for several intercompany adjustments. Normally, I wouldn't involve you, but the shareholder agreement requires dual confirmation for transactions connected to the warehouse financing. So Robert was moving faster than Miriam had expected. Did you approve anything? Susan asked. No, I told him I needed written confirmation from both shareholders. Susan closed her eyes briefly. Thank you for calling me first, Tom. After hanging up, she immediately contacted Miriam, who responded with a short, decisive instruction. Do not authorize anything. I'm preparing a formal notice now. That evening, Robert came home later than usual. Rainwater darkened the shoulders of his coat, and he seemed irritated before he even removed it. Tom Green has become unbelievably bureaucratic, he muttered. Susan folded a dish towel carefully. What happened? Nothing important. He's delaying routine adjustments because of old shareholder language. The language exists for a reason. Robert looked at her sharply. Since when are you interested in corporate governance? The question hung in the kitchen longer than either of them expected. Susan met his gaze calmly. Since our financial security apparently depends on it. For the first time since the wedding, genuine tension entered the room between them. Robert forced a laugh. You sound like one of Miriam Rosen's lectures. Maybe I've been listening more closely than you thought. He studied her face for a moment, searching for something, suspicion, accusation, evidence that she knew more than she should. Susan gave him none of it.
Eventually, he shrugged off the moment and headed for the shower. But she noticed that he took his phone with him into the bathroom, something he had never done before. That mattered too. The following Saturday, Maya and her new husband came over for brunch. The apartment filled with the comforting clutter of ordinary family life. Coffee cups, pastry boxes, laughter about honeymoon travel delays. Maya looked radiant and exhausted. Grandma, thank you again for everything you did for the wedding, she said. I don't know how you kept everyone organized. Susan smiled. I've had decades of practice managing difficult personalities. Robert chuckled from across the table, unaware of the double meaning. During brunch, Susan watched her granddaughter carefully. Maya was building a marriage with the same hopeful confidence Susan herself had once carried. She wanted desperately to protect that hope from the bitterness growing inside her. After the young couple left, Robert went to take a phone call on the fire escape. Through the kitchen window, Susan could hear fragments of his conversation. Temporary delay. She's asking more questions than usual. No, don't contact me at the apartment again. Elaine, undoubtedly. Susan returned to washing dishes, letting the hot water run over her hands until the plates were clean. On Monday, Miriam called with new information. Our notice to the auditors had an immediate effect, she said. They've frozen any significant warehouse-related transfers until the shareholder dispute is resolved. Dispute? Susan repeated. That's the formal term. It prevents Robert from claiming unanimous consent. Susan leaned back in her chair. How angry is he going to be when he finds out? Extremely, which is why we need to prepare for the next stage. Miriam explained that once the auditors began asking questions, Robert would have to decide whether to disclose the Harbor Ridge relationship voluntarily or risk having it discovered during a deeper review. People in his position often make mistakes when their timeline is disrupted, Miriam said. Watch for urgency. Watch for pressure to sign documents quickly. Watch for sudden emotional appeals. Susan thought of Robert bringing home wine and takeout, talking about quiet dinners and shared retirement plans, while simultaneously trying to move corporate assets beyond her reach. He may try all three, she said. That night she couldn't sleep. She walked through the apartment in darkness, touching familiar objects as if taking inventory of a life. The chipped ceramic bowl from their first apartment,
the framed photograph of Denise at age 10 holding a science fair ribbon, the old Yankees cap Robert had worn when he drove his first freight route to Buffalo. Near midnight, she stopped at the living room window overlooking Dean Street. Rain had ended, leaving the pavement shining under the streetlights. For years, Susan had believed that trust meant refusing to keep score in a marriage. You remembered anniversaries, forgave thoughtless comments, overlooked small disappointments, and assumed that the person beside you was protecting the same future you were. Now she understood something more complicated. Trust without attention is not generosity. Sometimes it is simply permission. Behind her, she heard Robert moving in the bedroom, restless even in sleep. Susan remained at the window, watching the reflected streetlights tremble in the wet pavement, and began mentally counting not what she might lose, but what she still controlled. The shareholder rights, the document copies, the auditor's attention, Miriam's strategy, and the fact that Robert still did not know the wedding tent had already betrayed him. The music from Maya's reception had long since faded, but the dance Robert had started behind that white canvas wall was only beginning, and Susan had finally learned the steps. 3 days after the auditors froze the warehouse-related transfers, Robert stopped pretending that his meetings were routine. He began leaving the apartment before sunrise and returning after dark. His phone never left his hand. Twice, Susan woke during the night and saw the glow of the screen reflected against the bedroom ceiling while he typed messages beside her. On Thursday morning, he announced, with studied casualness, that he would be spending the afternoon at the Albany warehouse. The operations team is making a mess of the inventory reconciliation, he said while knotting his tie. Susan buttered toast slowly. I thought the problem was lender negotiations. It's both. That sounds expensive. Robert gave a short, impatient smile. You don't need to worry about every operational detail. The sentence might once have passed unnoticed. Now it sounded like a door being deliberately closed. After he left, Susan called Miriam. He's going to Albany today. Good, Miriam replied. That gives us an opportunity. An opportunity turned out to be a man named Harold Whitaker. Harold met them in a small cafe near Borough Hall just after noon. He was in his late 70s, tall and slightly stooped, with careful silver hair and the alert eyes of someone who had spent decades reading contracts for hidden traps. Susan recognized him immediately. 25 years earlier, when Smith Atlantic Logistics expanded from local trucking into regional freight operations, Harold had been the corporate attorney who structured the company's first major financing agreements. He had attended Denise's high school graduation party and once spent an entire Thanksgiving explaining lease obligations to Robert on a paper tablecloth. I wish we were meeting under better circumstances, he said after they ordered coffee. Miriam handed him copies of the Harbor Ridge documents. Harold read silently for several minutes. His expression grew more serious with each page. Did Robert ever disclose Elaine Carter's ownership interest to the board? He asked. There is no active board anymore, Susan said. It's essentially Robert, me, and the outside accountant. Then did he disclose it to you? Susan shook her head. Harold removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. That's a significant omission. Miriam leaned forward. Harold, I need your memory. During the Albany expansion, why did you insist on dual shareholder approval for collateral-related transfers? A faint smile crossed his face. Because Susan asked better questions than Robert did. Susan blinked in surprise. Harold turned toward her. You probably don't remember this, but during one financing meeting, Robert wanted sole operational authority over all warehouse entities. You asked what would happen if a future lender tried to separate the warehouse assets from the family's ownership structure. Fragments of the meeting returned to her. A conference room in Albany, snow against the windows.
Robert impatient to finish, and her own discomfort with signing documents she did not fully understand. I remember asking whether my shares were merely symbolic, Susan said quietly. Exactly. And when I realized you were paying attention, I drafted the protective amendment. He tapped the shareholder agreement. This clause was not accidental. It was designed specifically to prevent one spouse from moving substantial warehouse assets without the other spouse's knowledge. Susan felt a strange mixture of gratitude and anger. A question she had asked decades earlier, almost apologetically, had become the reason Robert's current plan was failing. Harold asked several detailed questions about recent company activity. Had Robert discussed selling trucks? Were there new lenders involved? Had any family trusts been modified recently? Had Susan signed unusual tax or refinancing documents? She answered carefully. When she mentioned the repeated references to restructuring consultants, Harold exchanged a glance with Miriam. Susan, he said, I think Robert expected the bankruptcy filing to occur before anyone examined Harbor Ridge closely. The freeze imposed by the auditors has disrupted that sequence. Can he still file for bankruptcy? Of course, but bankruptcy would now invite scrutiny rather than provide cover. That distinction changed everything. Until now, Susan had imagined herself defending against an unstoppable process. Harold was telling her that the process itself might become dangerous for Robert if it proceeded under investigation. Before they left, Harold reached into his briefcase and removed a thin folder. I brought something you should have, he said. Inside was a copy of an old memorandum dated March 14th, 2001. Subject: Protective Shareholder Structure, Albany Expansion. Harold had written it to both Robert and Susan after the financing closed. One paragraph was highlighted in yellow. The dual consent provision is intended to preserve equal oversight of warehouse collateral and prevent unilateral diversion of assets through affiliated entities. Affiliated entities. Harbor Ridge was precisely such an entity. Susan stared at the sentence for a long moment. Robert received this memo? Yes, Harold said. I sent identical copies to both of you. Which meant her husband had not forgotten the restriction. He had attempted to work around it. That evening, Robert returned from Albany in a noticeably better mood than he had shown all week. Productive trip, he announced, hanging up his coat. I think we're finally getting ahead of the financing issues. Susan set 2 bowls of soup on the table. That's good news. Actually, he continued, sitting down, I may need your help with a few administrative items tomorrow. Some lenders want updated shareholder confirmations and authorization forms. There it was, pressure to sign documents quickly, exactly as Miriam had predicted. Susan kept her expression neutral. What kind of authorization forms? Routine corporate housekeeping, mostly confirming management authority during the restructuring period. Leave them with me overnight and I'll read them carefully. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face almost instantly. They're standard forms, Susan. Then reading them shouldn't be a problem. For a moment, neither of them touched their food. Robert forced another smile. You've become very cautious lately. Susan folded her napkin. Maybe I'm finally learning from experience. The documents arrived the next morning in a navy folder labeled Temporary Operational Authority Package. Susan waited until Robert left for another meeting before opening it. The first pages were harmless enough. Updated contact information, insurance acknowledgments, and lender communication protocols. Then she found the critical section. Resolution 4B, Interim Management Authority. Buried in dense legal language was a clause granting the Chief Executive Officer authority to transfer interests between affiliated warehouse entities, pledge warehouse collateral,
execute asset separation agreements, and approve intercompany settlements without additional shareholder consent during the restructuring period. In other words, the document would effectively neutralize the protection Harold had drafted 25 years earlier.
Susan photographed every page and sent the images to Miriam. The response came within minutes. "Do not sign anything. Bring the originals to my office immediately." This is the first direct attempt to bypass the dual consent restriction. Susan placed the unsigned documents back into the folder exactly as she had found them. For the first time since the wedding, she felt not only betrayed, but angry. Robert had sat across from her at their kitchen table, spoken about shared financial pressure, and attempted to obtain her signature on documents that would have given him the power to complete the very asset transfers he was concealing. The cruelty was not in the affair. It was in the assumption that she would sign because she trusted him. That night, Robert asked casually, "Did you get a chance to look at the paperwork?" Susan met his eyes across the dinner table. "Yes." "And?" She took a slow sip of tea before answering. "I'd like Miriam Rosen to review it before I sign anything." The silence that followed was immediate and absolute. Robert set down his fork. "Why would you involve Miriam in routine operational documents?" "Because they don't look routine to me." His jaw tightened slightly. "Susan, every hour we spend delaying these approvals makes the company's situation more difficult." "Then perhaps the company should have explained the situation more clearly before asking for signatures." For several seconds, he simply stared at her. Not with the confidence of the man in the wedding tent, but with the first unmistakable hint of uncertainty. Susan saw him calculating possibilities. Had the auditors told her something? Had Tom Green contacted her? Had Miriam become involved independently? Or had his wife simply become less obedient than he expected? He could not ask the real question without revealing too much. Finally, he pushed the folder aside. "Fine," he said. "Have Miriam review it." Susan nodded calmly. "I will." Robert resumed eating, but the easy rhythm of their shared meals was gone. Between them sat an unsigned folder, a 25-year-old protective clause, and the growing realization that the woman he planned to outmaneuver was no longer standing where he had left her. And somewhere in Albany, hidden behind warehouse inventories and restructuring meetings, the structure Harold Whitaker had built decades earlier was beginning to do exactly what it had been designed to do: stop one spouse from quietly stealing the future from the other. The following Tuesday, Robert left the apartment before dawn without waking Susan. She heard the front door close softly at 5:17 a.m. and remained still in bed, listening to the silence that followed. A year earlier, she would have assumed he was dealing with an urgent shipping problem. Now she waited 5 minutes, got up, and checked the kitchen calendar where Robert sometimes scribbled travel notes. Nothing. No Albany, no Manhattan meeting, no client visit. Just an empty square beneath the date. Susan made coffee and sat at the dining table with the unsigned authorization folder beside her. At 6:03, her phone buzzed with a message from Miriam. "Emergency call in 10 minutes. Harold is joining us." Susan's stomach tightened. Harold's voice came through the speakerphone sounding unusually grave. "We've received information from Tom Green," he began. "Late yesterday, Robert attempted to schedule a special executive session at the company headquarters for tonight." "About what?" Susan asked. He described it as a confidential restructuring authorization meeting. Miriam picked up the explanation. Tom became concerned because the proposed agenda included approval of intercompany settlements involving Harbor Ridge Holdings. Susan looked at the Navy folder on the table. "Without my signature?" Apparently, Robert intended to argue that the temporary authority package would become effective through emergency management necessity. Susan felt a wave of cold anger. But I never signed it. Exactly, Miriam said, which means he may be preparing to proceed as if your consent is implied or imminent. Harold spoke carefully. Susan, I think we've moved beyond precaution. We need to confront the corporate side of this directly before tonight's meeting occurs. By noon, Susan was sitting in Miriam's office again, this time with a formal packet of documents spread across the conference table. Miriam had prepared 3 things: a written objection to any asset transfer authorization involving Harbor Ridge, a notice of disputed shareholder consent, and a demand for preservation of all corporate records related to the Albany warehouse and affiliated entities. The language was precise, almost surgical.
Once these are delivered, Miriam explained, any attempt to proceed without addressing the dispute becomes much harder to defend later. Susan signed each document carefully. Her signature looked steadier than she felt. Before leaving, Miriam asked, "Are you emotionally prepared for the possibility that Robert realizes today that you know far more than he expected?" Susan thought about the wedding tent, the whispered phrase, "the tiresome Susan," and the months, perhaps years, during which her husband had been constructing a future that did not include her. "I'm not prepared," she admitted, "but I'm ready." Smith Atlantic Logistics occupied 2 floors of a glass and brick office building near the Brooklyn waterfront. Susan had not visited regularly since retiring from part-time administrative work almost a decade earlier, but the receptionist still recognized her immediately. "Mrs. Smith, we haven't seen you in ages." "Just stopping by to drop off some paperwork." Tom Green met her near the elevators. He looked relieved to see her. "Robert isn't here yet," he said quietly. "The executive session is scheduled for 7 tonight." He led her into a small accounting office away from the main corridor. Stacks of freight invoices, fuel reports, and driver manifests covered the desks. The familiar smell of paper, coffee, and machine toner brought back memories of the company's early years when Susan processed payroll by hand. Tom closed the door. "I need you to know something," he said. "Over the last 6 months, Robert has been under enormous pressure from someone connected to Harbor Ridge. I assumed it was a lender or investor until I saw the ownership records Miriam requested." "Did you know about Elaine?" Tom shook his head emphatically. "No, but I did know the Harbor Ridge transactions didn't make business sense. Money kept moving out of profitable freight operations into entities that produced very little documented revenue." He handed Susan a spreadsheet. Large transfers were highlighted in yellow. The pattern was unmistakable. Profitable divisions drained, affiliated entities funded, liabilities concentrated in the operating company that would later claim financial distress. Susan studied the numbers silently. This was no impulsive affair that had led to reckless decisions. It was a coordinated financial strategy. At 4:30 p.m., Miriam's notices were delivered electronically and by courier to Robert Smith, the company's auditors, the primary warehouse lender, and the corporate records department. Tom watched the confirmation receipts appear on his computer screen. "He's going to see these within minutes," he said. As if summoned by the words, the outer office door opened sharply. Robert entered. Even from across the corridor, Susan could tell he had already read the notices. His face was pale with controlled fury. He stopped when he saw her standing beside Tom's desk. For a long second, none of them spoke. Then Robert said, very quietly, "Tom, leave us." Tom glanced at Susan. She gave a small nod, and he slipped out, closing the door behind him. Robert held the courier envelope in one hand. "What is this?" Susan remained standing. "Exactly what it says, a disputed shareholder notice." His eyes moved across her face, searching for uncertainty. "You went to Miriam behind my back?" Susan almost laughed at the absurdity of the accusation. Behind your back, Robert? He ignored the question. Do you have any idea what damage this could cause? Lenders panic when they see language like this. Then perhaps they should examine why such language became necessary. Robert threw the envelope onto the desk. This is about the authorization forms, isn't it? You've let Miriam convince you that routine restructuring is some kind of conspiracy. The word conspiracy hung between them like a test. Susan took a slow breath.
Harbor Ridge Holdings is owned 60% by you and 40% by Elaine Carter. The color drained from his face so quickly that she knew she had struck the truth cleanly. For the first time since their marriage began, Susan watched Robert lose control of his expression completely. Where did you get that information? From company documents. He recovered almost immediately, switching from shock to calculation. Elaine is an investor. Harbor Ridge was created to facilitate the Albany expansion. An investor you kiss behind wedding tents? The silence that followed was absolute. Robert stared at her as if seeing a stranger. So there it was, the hidden card finally placed on the table. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. You were spying on me. No, Susan said evenly. I was looking for bottled water for our granddaughter. The rest was provided by your own carelessness. Robert turned away, running a hand through his hair. For several moments he said nothing. Then, surprisingly, his anger softened into something that sounded almost weary. Susan, this isn't as simple as it looks. Then make it simpler. He leaned against the desk. The company has been struggling for years. Freight margins are shrinking, fuel costs are unpredictable, and the Albany warehouse became far more expensive than we anticipated. Harbor Ridge was supposed to protect part of the business while we stabilize operations. And Elaine's ownership interest? Robert hesitated. That developed later. Susan looked at him steadily. The ownership documents are 3 years old. Another hesitation. Another lie collapsing under a document she already possessed. Outside the office windows, evening light was fading over the harbor. Trucks moved slowly through the freight yards below, headlights beginning to appear one by one. Robert's shoulders sagged slightly. What do you want from me? It was the first honest question he had asked her in weeks. Susan considered it carefully. Part of her wanted an apology. Part wanted an explanation that could somehow restore the decades they had shared. But sitting in the office they had helped build together, surrounded by evidence of deliberate deception, she understood that neither would change the facts. I want the truth, she said. Robert looked down at the scattered spreadsheets. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. The bankruptcy filing was intended to separate the operating liabilities from the protected assets. After that, I planned to leave. The words landed with less drama than Susan might once have imagined. The real wound had been inflicted behind the white tent wall. This was merely the formal acknowledgement of it. She asked the question that mattered most. And my share of those protected assets? Robert did not answer immediately. That silence told her everything. At 6:45 p.m., the scheduled executive session was canceled. Tom later informed them that the auditors had refused to proceed until the shareholder dispute and Harbor Ridge transactions were independently reviewed. The lenders had also requested additional documentation before considering any restructuring proposal. Robert's carefully constructed timeline had collapsed in a single afternoon. As Susan gathered her handbag to leave, he spoke once more. You're destroying the company. She paused at the office door. No, Robert, she said quietly. I'm preventing you from destroying me with it. Then she walked out into the Brooklyn evening, leaving behind the empty conference room where her husband had planned to secure the final authority he needed.
The office lights glowed behind her as she stepped onto the wet sidewalk overlooking the harbor. Somewhere inside that building, accountants were preserving records, auditors were asking new questions, and Robert Smith was beginning to understand a fact he should have remembered long ago. The woman he dismissed as cautious had spent 40 years learning exactly how his business worked. And now, she was no longer protecting his secrets. The rain returned the night after the canceled executive session. Susan sat alone in the living room while water tapped steadily against the windows of the Dean Street apartment. Robert had not come home. A single message arrived at 11:42 p.m. Staying in Manhattan. We'll talk tomorrow. For 42 years, those words would have worried her. She would have called hospitals, checked traffic reports, imagined accidents on wet highways. Now she set the phone face down and continued reviewing the notes Miriam had prepared for the next stage. At midnight, another message arrived, this time from Tom Green. The auditors are requesting full access to Harbor Ridge records tomorrow morning. Robert was furious when he received the notice. Susan read the message twice, then walked to the kitchen and made chamomile tea in the chipped blue mug Robert had bought her during a freight conference in Syracuse 20 years earlier. Memory was becoming inconveniently crowded with objects that had once meant love. The next morning began with a phone call from Maya. "Grandma, are you and Grandpa okay?" Susan closed her eyes briefly. "Why are you asking that?" "He sounded strange when I called to thank him again for the wedding gift, and Mom says there's some kind of business problem." Susan looked out at the rain-darkened brownstones across the street. This was the part she had dreaded most. Not the lawyers, not the documents, but the moment when the fracture would begin spreading through the family. "Your grandfather and I are dealing with some serious financial and personal issues," she said carefully. "None of this has anything to do with you or your marriage." Maya was quiet for a moment. "Did something happen at the wedding?" Susan thought of the white tent, the whispered promises, the phrase, "free of the tiresome Susan." "Yes," she said softly. "Something happened that made me realize I needed to protect myself." Maya's voice became gentle in the way adult grandchildren sometimes speak when they suddenly understand that their grandparents are not fixed historical figures, but vulnerable people living complicated lives in the present. "What do you need from me?" "Right now? Just be happy with your husband. Let me handle the rest." After they hung up, Susan cried for the first time since the wedding. Not for Robert, for the innocence that had been lost from Maya's memory of that day. At 2 o'clock, Susan arrived at Smith Atlantic headquarters for what Miriam called the preservation meeting. The conference room looked different from the one where Robert had tried to secure emergency authority. This time, the long table was occupied by Miriam Rosen, Harold Whittaker, Tom Green, 2 representatives from the outside auditing firm, and a lawyer for the company's primary warehouse lender. Robert entered last. He looked exhausted. His suit was immaculate, but the skin beneath his eyes was gray with sleeplessness. Elaine was not present. That absence told Susan that the situation had moved beyond private romance and into territory where lawyers preferred distance. The lead auditor, a calm woman named Patricia Sue, opened the meeting. This session concerns the disputed shareholder consent relating to Albany Warehouse Collateral and affiliated entities, including Harbor Ridge Holdings. Hearing the affair reduced to the phrase affiliated entities felt strangely surreal. Patricia continued, "Our objective is not to determine marital issues. Our objective is to determine whether corporate assets were transferred appropriately and whether any proposed restructuring relies on disputed authorizations." Robert folded his hands tightly on the table. The transfers were legitimate business transactions. Patricia nodded. Then providing complete documentation should resolve the matter. For the next 3 hours, the auditors walked through transaction after transaction. Dates, transfer amounts, entity ownership, collateral schedules, internal approvals. Several times, Robert attempted to characterize Harbor Ridge as an independent investment vehicle. Each time, Tom produced records showing operational connections between Harbor Ridge and Smith Atlantic Logistics that had not been fully disclosed in shareholder reports. The most damaging moment came when Harold presented the 2001 memorandum describing the purpose of the dual consent provision. Patricia read the highlighted paragraph aloud. Prevent unilateral diversion of assets through affiliated entities. She looked directly at Robert. Mr. Smith, were you aware of this restriction when the Harbor Ridge transfers were authorized? The room became very quiet. Robert could not credibly claim ignorance. The memorandum had been sent to both shareholders. After a long pause, he answered, "Yes." Patricia made a note. Susan watched his hand tremble slightly as he reached for a glass of water. The meeting recessed briefly at 5:30. Susan stepped into the hallway outside the conference room, where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the harbor. Freight trucks moved through the terminal below, their trailers reflecting the wet evening light. A minute later, Robert joined her. For several seconds, they stood side by side without speaking. Finally, he said, "Did you ever love me?" The question was so unexpected that Susan turned toward him in genuine surprise. "Of course I did." "Then how do we get here?" She considered the harbor before answering. "I think we got here one small secret at a time." Robert leaned against the window frame. "Elaine made me feel like I wasn't finished yet. The company had become constant pressure, and at home I felt managed." Susan almost laughed through the ache in her chest. "Managed? Robert, I spent decades keeping your life from falling apart. I remembered the insurance renewals, the driver birthdays, your mother's medication schedule, the tax deadlines, the church donations, and the names of every employee's children. That wasn't management. That was partnership." He looked away. Maybe I stopped seeing the difference. That, Susan realized, was probably the truest thing he had said in years. When the meeting resumed, the lender's attorney announced a preliminary decision. Because of the disputed transfers and unresolved shareholder consent issues, the bank would suspend approval of the proposed restructuring, require independent review of Harbor Ridge transactions, and place additional oversight conditions on Smith Atlantic's warehouse financing. In practical terms, Robert no longer had unilateral control over the process he had designed. The final blow came from Patricia Sue. "Until the review is complete," she said, "we recommend that no extraordinary transfers, settlements, or affiliated entity transactions occur without written approval from both shareholders and external counsel." Miriam's expression remained professionally neutral, but Susan saw the significance immediately. The protective structure had held. Robert sat motionless as the meeting adjourned. Most of the participants left quickly, gathering laptops and folders as evening settled over the harbor. Soon only Susan and Robert remained in the conference room that had once hosted expansion celebrations, annual bonuses, and retirement party speeches. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above them. Robert stared at the darkened tabletop. What happens now? Susan took her time answering. The auditors will review everything. The lenders will decide what they're willing to support, and we'll have to discuss our marriage separately from the company. He gave a tired, humorless smile. You've become very precise. I learned from watching you. For the first time, he seemed to understand the full extent of what had changed. The woman sitting across from him was no longer reacting emotionally to betrayal.
She was making structured decisions about her future. Robert looked older than he had a week earlier. Elaine thinks I should fight this aggressively. Susan gathered her papers into a neat stack. Then Elaine is giving you poor advice. He flinched slightly at the mention of her name. Outside, the rain had stopped. Susan rode the elevator down alone and stepped onto the waterfront promenade. The air smelled of salt, diesel, and wet concrete, the same mixture that had clung to Robert's clothes when he drove freight routes himself decades ago. Her phone buzzed with a message from Miriam. The bank's position is stronger than I expected. He cannot move the warehouse assets now. We'll discuss next steps tomorrow. Susan slipped the phone back into her pocket and looked across the dark water toward Manhattan, where office lights shimmered like distant constellations. She did not feel victorious. Victory belonged to games, elections, and court cases. What she felt was something quieter and more complicated. The exhaustion of a woman who had finally stopped carrying the weight of another person's deception. Behind her, in the building she had just left, Robert Smith was sitting in an empty conference room facing auditors, lenders, and the collapse of the future he had secretly planned. And for the first time since hearing his voice behind the white wedding tent, Susan understood that the most painful chapter of her marriage was ending not with shouting or revenge, but with the simple, irreversible fact that she had refused to sign away her own life. October arrived with the smell of fallen leaves and the first sharp wind coming off the East River. 2 months had passed since Maya's wedding. The photographs had been printed and placed in cream-colored albums, Maya laughing beneath the church steps, the newlyweds dancing under the white tent, Denise wiping tears from her eyes during the vows. Susan could look at the pictures now without hearing every whispered word that had been spoken behind the fabric wall that same afternoon. Time had not erased the memory. It had simply stopped it from controlling every breath she took. The auditor's review produced results more complicated than Susan had imagined. Smith Atlantic Logistics was not entirely insolvent. The freight business remained profitable in several divisions, but millions of dollars had been routed through Harbor Ridge Holdings under terms that were poorly documented and inadequately disclosed. The lenders demanded a formal restructuring supervised by independent financial advisors, and Robert was removed from sole operational control pending completion of the review. He was not ruined overnight. Real life rarely delivered punishment with cinematic efficiency. Instead, his world contracted piece by piece. Executive authority suspended, discretionary accounts frozen, lender oversight imposed, and every significant financial decision subjected to scrutiny from people who no longer trusted his explanations. Elaine resigned from Harbor Ridge within weeks of the investigation becoming formal. Her lawyer communicated through Miriam's office regarding document production and potential liability exposure. Susan never spoke to her again. That absence felt less dramatic than she would once have expected. Some relationships ended with confrontation. Others ended when the fantasy that sustained them could no longer survive daylight. Robert moved into a furnished apartment in Manhattan while the divorce proceedings began. The first weeks were awkward and strangely polite. They communicated mostly through attorneys about financial records, property inventories, and temporary living arrangements. Occasionally, Robert called directly, usually about practical matters. Do you know where the original Buffalo distribution contract is? Second drawer of the hall cabinet. Has the property tax notice arrived? It's on the desk by the window. 42 years of shared life could not be untangled in a single season. One rainy Thursday, he came to the apartment to collect additional clothing and personal papers. Susan was in the kitchen making soup when he arrived. For a moment, the scene looked almost ordinary. Robert hanging his coat by the door, Susan stirring a pot on the stove, jazz playing softly from the radio. Ordinary except for the distance between them. He packed quietly for several minutes before speaking. Maya invited me to dinner next Sunday. I know, she invited me too. Are you going? Susan tasted the soup before answering. Yes, she shouldn't have to choose between us. Robert nodded slowly. You've handled this better than I deserved. Susan turned off the burner. No, Robert, I've handled it better than I deserved. He looked at her then with an expression she had not seen in many years. Not irritation, not defensiveness, but genuine regret. When I started Harbor Ridge, I told myself it was temporary. Then the lies became easier than the conversations I should have had with you. Susan leaned against the counter. That may be true, she said softly. But easier for you became dangerous for me. He had no answer to that. Before leaving, he paused beside the dining table where the wedding album lay open to a photograph of Maya and her husband beneath the glowing reception lights. Robert touched the edge of the page lightly. It was a beautiful wedding. Susan looked at the same photograph and thought about how two completely different stories could exist within a single frame. The beginning of a young marriage and the quiet end of an old one. Yes, she said, it really was. In November, the divorce settlement was finalized. Because of the jointly held warehouse interests and the documented Harbor Ridge transactions, Susan retained substantial ownership rights in the restructured company assets. She also kept the Brooklyn apartment and received a secured financial settlement that could not be undermined by the pending corporate review. When Miriam called with the final numbers, Susan sat silently for a long moment. You protected yourself, Miriam said. My mother protected me, Susan replied. That evening, she opened the hall closet and removed the small brass key from the envelope where she had placed it after the settlement conference. She went downstairs to the basement storage room one last time. The metal box was exactly where it had always been, surrounded by Christmas ornaments, school papers, and decades of accumulated family life. Susan unlocked it and looked through the contents slowly. Partnership agreements, warehouse amendments, insurance copies, Harbor Ridge records, and at the very bottom, folded into a yellowed envelope, a note in her mother's handwriting. Trust kindness, verify promises, keep one door that only you can open. Susan sat on the folding chair and cried quietly, not from heartbreak this time, but from the overwhelming realization that her mother had understood something about survival that younger Susan had been too romantic to appreciate. December brought Maya and her husband back to Brooklyn for their first married Christmas. The apartment filled with familiar sounds, wrapping paper tearing, Denise arguing cheerfully about dessert, holiday music playing too loudly from the living room speaker. For the first time since the wedding, the gathering felt genuinely warm rather than carefully maintained. After dinner, Maya helped Susan wash dishes. Grandma, she said gently, are you lonely? Susan considered the question honestly. The truthful answer surprised her. Sometimes, she admitted. But loneliness is different from living beside someone who has already left you in his mind. Maya dried a plate thoughtfully. I've been angry at Grandpa. That's understandable. Are you? Susan looked through the kitchen doorway at the family laughing in the living room. I was angry, she said. Now I'm mostly grateful that I learned the truth while I could still do something with it. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, Susan sat alone by the window overlooking Dean Street. Snow had begun to fall in thin, uncertain flakes that melted almost immediately on the pavement. The apartment was quiet, except for the soft ticking of the old wall clock. On the table beside her lay two objects, the brass key and a recent photograph of Maya and her husband standing outside St. Bartholomew's Church. Susan realized that the key no longer represented suspicion. It represented agency. For years, she had mistaken self-protection for cynicism. She believed that keeping copies of documents, maintaining independent access to information, and asking careful questions were signs that she did not trust deeply enough. Now she understood that mature love and personal responsibility were not opposites. You could love someone wholeheartedly and still refuse to surrender your ability to protect your own future. Outside, snow continued drifting past the streetlights. Susan picked up the brass key, walked to the hall closet, and placed it back on the shelf. Not hidden this time, simply stored among the ordinary belongings of her life. Then she returned to the window and looked out at Brooklyn, settling into winter. Her marriage had ended. Her family had changed. The company she helped build would continue under new oversight, carrying traces of both the man who drove the first freight truck and the woman who kept the records that ultimately prevented him from erasing her place in that history. And somewhere in a wedding album, preserved forever in glossy photographs, a smiling grandmother stood beneath a white reception tent. No one looking at those pictures would know that, only minutes before they were taken, she had overheard the conversation that saved her from losing everything. But Susan knew. And for the first time in many years, that knowledge no longer felt like a wound. It felt like the beginning of the life she would live on her own terms.